Today, we need to talk about some of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. Now, this is obviously a difficult subject, but it's absolutely crucial to look at these events to really understand the full scope of the conflict and, honestly, its lasting impact on our world.
I want to start with a number, just a number, on its own. Let's just let that sit there for a second. 33,771. That is the number of Jewish men, women, and children who were shot and killed in a single massacre. And it happened in just 48 hours. This is the reality of what we're discussing today. It's not some abstract history. It's profound human tragedy on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend.
So, to make sense of these huge and frankly overwhelming events, here's the roadmap for our explainer. We're going to start with atrocities in the Pacific, then move to Axis crimes in Europe. Then we'll look at the controversial bombings by the Allies, before wrapping it all up with a discussion on justice and memory.
Okay, so let's begin in the Pacific theater. It's important to remember that the war in Asia had already been raging for years before the invasion of Poland even happened.
In December of 1937, Japanese forces took the Chinese capital of Nanjing. What came next was 6 straight weeks of just unrestrained brutality. Estimates suggest that over 200,000 people were killed, from mass executions to horrific house-to-house slaughters. After the war, some limited justice was served, but so many of the perpetrators were never prosecuted, and the event is still a major point of tension even today.
And this brings us to a key concept in how these things happen: dehumanization. At a secret facility in Manchuria, known as Unit 731, Japanese researchers performed some of the most horrific experiments imaginable on living people. We're talking about infecting them with the plague, dissecting them alive with no anesthesia, testing weapons on them. And to do this, they first had to strip their victims of all humanity, calling them simply maruta, which means logs.
So what happened after the war? Well, in what has to be one of history's most chilling bargains, the United States granted complete immunity from prosecution to the unit's commander, Shiro Ishii, and his top researchers. And why? In exchange for all their data on biological warfare, data they got from mass murder, they were just allowed to walk free.
Over in the Philippines, the treatment of prisoners of war hit an infamous low. In April 1942, after the single largest surrender in American military history, 76,000 Allied soldiers were forced on a 60-mile march. They were already starving, and then they were denied food and water. If you fell behind, you were beaten, you were bayoneted, or you were shot. And the few who actually survived the march then had to face the horrific conditions of Camp O'Donnell, where tens of thousands more died from disease and neglect.
And this brutality wasn't just limited to soldiers. This number, 100,000, that's the estimated number of Filipino civilians who were murdered by Japanese forces during the month-long Manila Massacre in 1945, right as American forces were liberating the city. It was one of the single worst urban atrocities of the entire war.
Let's shift our focus now to the European theater, a place where systematic murder was so often followed by decades, and I mean decades, of denial.
You know, this next event is as much about the crime as it is about the 50-year lie that followed it. In 1940, the Soviet secret police executed 22,000 members of Poland's leadership class, officers, intellectuals, elites. When German forces found the graves 3 years later, the Soviets immediately blamed the Nazis. And they stuck to that lie for almost 50 years, until 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev finally, officially, admitted Soviet guilt.
In France, just 4 days after the D-Day landings, an entire village was basically erased from the map in a single afternoon. On June 10, 1944, an SS Panzer Division rolled into Oradour-sur-Glane and completely sealed it off. Nobody could get out.
Then they separated the men from their families. They led them to barns, shot them in the leg so they couldn't possibly escape, and then they set the barns on fire. Meanwhile, all the women and the 205 children were forced into the town church. The SS barred the doors, set it ablaze, and then machine-gunned anyone who tried to escape the flames. A total of 642 civilians were murdered that day. By order of Charles de Gaulle, the ruins of the village have been left exactly as they were, a permanent, haunting memorial.
Now, while the industrial scale of the concentration camps is rightly infamous, a huge part of the Holocaust also happened by bullets, in ravines and forests all across Eastern Europe. We started with Babi Yar in Ukraine. A tragically similar site was the Panerai Forest in Lithuania, where somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people, mostly Jews, were shot and dumped into abandoned fuel pits. And in both cases, the story is grimly familiar. The Nazis tried to destroy the evidence by burning the bodies, and later, the Soviets suppressed the fact that the vast majority of the victims were Jewish.
We now have to turn to one of the most debated aspects of the entire war, the Allied bombing campaigns. The question here isn't just about what happened, but whether these actions, which killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, were a legitimate military strategy or if they crossed the line into being a war crime.
So let's look at the arguments for two of the most controversial raids. First, Dresden. The official justification was to attack a key transport hub to help the Soviets, but critics point out that Germany was already on the verge of collapse and the city was packed with refugees. Then you have Tokyo. The stated goal was to break civilian morale, but this meant deliberately targeting a densely packed residential area made mostly of wood, creating a massive firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night.
You know, the moral ambiguity of this whole situation was maybe best captured by the man who ordered the raid on Tokyo, General Curtis LeMay. He made this incredibly stark admission after the war. It's a powerful acknowledgement that the line between a victorious military act and a prosecutable war crime can be terrifyingly thin.
So, after examining all of these horrific events across different theaters perpetrated by different powers, what can we possibly take away from all this? Is there anything that connects these tragedies?
Well, across all of these disparate events, you start to see these common dark threads emerge. There's that systematic dehumanization, right? Calling people logs. There's the deliberate destruction of evidence, from burning bodies at Penerier to burning documents at Unit 731. We see decades of denial and cover-ups, like with the Katyn massacre. And all of this often leads to an incomplete pursuit of justice, which means, in the end, what we're left with is the enduring and absolutely vital power of memory.
And this really brings us to our final, and I think most crucial question, because this isn't just about looking back into the past. It's about looking at ourselves right now. How does confronting these darkest moments of human history, honestly, without flinching, how does that shape our understanding of justice, of responsibility, and of our own shared humanity today?